The Senate chamber was buzzing with reporters and cameras as Senator Tommy Tuberville leaned back in his chair, smirking. He thought he had his moment, mocking Representative Jasmine Crockett during a heated debate on veteran healthcare funding. "Maybe you just don't understand sacrifice the way real Americans do," Tuberville sneered, drawing chuckles from a few allies. He expected Crockett to stumble, maybe lose her composure. But she didn't. Instead, Crockett calmly pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. The room quieted as she held it up. "This," she began, her voice steady, "is a letter my father wrote during the Vietnam War. He carried it in his pack until the day he returned home. It's addressed to his family, words he wrote, not knowing if he'd survive another night." The chamber froze. Cameras zoomed in. Tuberville's grin slipped. Crockett unfolded the letter and read aloud. It spoke of fear, of honor, of the hope that his sacrifice would mean something for the generations to come. The words weren't political, they were raw, human, and undeniably powerful. When she finished, the silence was deafening. Senators shifted uncomfortably. The audience in the gallery leaned forward, some visibly emotional. Crockett then looked Tuberville directly in the eye. "You mocked me. But my family lived the sacrifices you're dismissing. So before you lecture me about understanding service, remember, my father's courage paid for the freedom of your smirk." The chamber erupted in applause. Tuberville had no comeback. His lips tightened, but he said nothing. The smirk was gone. That single moment, Jasmine Crockett reading her father's Vietnam letter, spread like wildfire online. Clips hit millions of views within hours. Commentators replayed Tuberville's silence again and again. What began as a mockery turned into a lesson. And Crockett didn't just win the debate, she made history with a letter written decades ago on the battlefield of Vietnam. Tuberville shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering for the first time. The cameras caught the flicker of discomfort on his face, and it was replayed instantly on screens across the chamber. He cleared his throat as if preparing to interrupt, but Crockett's presence was commanding, her voice steady and unwavering. "Senator," she said firmly, "you can laugh at me if you want. But you won't laugh at the men and women who actually put their lives on the line. You certainly won't laugh at my father." She let the words hang in the air. The chamber, usually filled with background noise of papers shuffling and side conversations, had gone eerily still. Even her critics, who often rolled their eyes during her speeches, leaned in now. Jasmine's hand remained on the letter. Her composure, her tone, and the weight of history on that fragile paper turned the entire room against Tuberville's mockery. Tuberville tried to regain control of the moment, forcing a laugh. "Well, Representative, nobody's questioning your father. We're just having a debate, that's all." His words sounded thin, almost defensive, and the cameras picked up every ounce of strain in his tone. But Crockett didn't let him escape. She leaned forward, her gaze sharp and unflinching. "This isn't just a debate, Senator. When you mock my commitment to service, you mock the sacrifices of every family who's waited by the door for a letter like this one. You belittle the courage of those who risked everything so you could sit here and sneer." Gasps rippled through the room. Even reporters, who had come expecting another routine clash, scribbled frantically in their notebooks, knowing this was turning into the moment of the night. Tuberville opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched, and Crockett seized it like a weapon. Crockett slowly lifted the letter again, the paper trembling just slightly from age but not from her hands. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "My father wrote this while bombs fell over his unit. He told my mother that if he didn't make it home, he wanted me, his daughter, to grow up knowing the meaning of sacrifice. He wanted me to stand tall when others tried to belittle what service truly meant." The chamber was frozen. A few lawmakers bowed their heads, clearly moved. The camera zoomed in on Tuberville, his smirk was gone, replaced with an uneasy stiffness. Crockett continued, her tone sharpening. "So when you mock me, Senator, remember that I carry not just my father's words but the legacy of every soldier who ever bled for this country. You can mock me, but you cannot erase them." Her words struck like a hammer, each syllable measured and powerful. The audience erupted in murmurs, a wave of support building around her. Tuberville shifted again, his hand nervously adjusting his tie. The confidence he had strutted in with was slipping through his fingers, and everyone in the chamber saw it. He finally muttered, I wasn't mocking your father." Crockett didn't flinch. "But you mocked me, and by extension, every veteran's child who has carried the weight of that service. You think this is a game, but for families like mine, it was life and death. We buried friends. We sat by windows waiting for news. We carried scars that politics will never heal." A stunned hush swept across the room. For once, Tuberville didn't have a punchline or a retort. He sat back, eyes darting between cameras and colleagues, realizing how badly the tables had turned. The spectators in the gallery, many of them veterans and their families, broke into spontaneous applause. Their claps echoed against the chamber walls, drowning out the senator's silence. Crockett folded the letter with care, almost ceremonially, as though her father himself had just entered the room to finish the debate for her. Within minutes of the exchange, reporters were already rushing to file breaking alerts. Clips of Crockett holding up her father's Vietnam letter flooded social media, shared with captions like, "This is what real leadership looks like," and Tuberville silenced by history itself. Cable news channels cut into regular programming to replay the footage. The clip of Tuberville smirking before being struck silent played on a loop, side by side with Crockett's unwavering delivery. Commentators marveled at how one moment had completely flipped the narrative of the hearing. Veterans groups quickly weighed in, praising Crockett for elevating their sacrifices above politics. She gave voice to every soldier who ever wrote home not knowing if they'd see another sunrise, one statement read. Meanwhile, Tuberville's office scrambled. His staff released a short statement insisting he hadn't meant any disrespect, but the damage was already done. Online, the headlines wrote themselves, "Crockett schools Tuberville with Vietnam letter," and smirk meets silence. The story had broken free of the chamber. Now it belonged to the public. By the next morning, Tuberville was at the center of a storm he hadn't anticipated. His office phones rang non-stop with calls from veterans and their families, most of them furious. One Vietnam veteran's voice trembled as he told a local radio station, "I buried friends over there." To see a senator mock someone carrying her father's words from that war. That cuts deep. Editorials piled on. Newspapers across the country ran headlines highlighting the clash. One opinion column read, "Crockett spoke with her father's voice, and Tuberville had none." At town halls back in his state, Tuberville faced uncomfortable questions from constituents. "Do you regret laughing at her?" one man pressed, as cameras rolled. Tuberville tried to deflect, saying it was all political theater, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, Crockett's stock rose. She appeared on morning shows, speaking not with anger but with calm clarity about her father's letter, veteran sacrifices, and the responsibility of lawmakers to honor them. Viewers praised her authenticity, and clips from her interviews spread even faster than before. Tuberville, for the first time in months, found himself completely on the defensive. Crockett didn't waste the moment. While Tuberville scrambled to repair his image, she seized the spotlight and redirected it toward a cause larger than their clash. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by veterans and their families, she addressed the cameras. "My father's letter is not just a relic of the past," she declared. "It's a reminder that we cannot play games with the lives of those who served. If you mock their families, you mock their sacrifice. If you stall their healthcare, you betray their service." The crowd erupted in cheers. Veterans in uniform raised their hands in salute, while families held up photos of loved ones who had served. The image was powerful, and news outlets plastered it everywhere. Crockett then unveiled a new push for a comprehensive veteran healthcare package, tying it directly to the story of her father's letter. "We have a duty to ensure that no veteran waits months for care, no family goes broke paying for prescriptions, and no soldier's sacrifice is reduced to a punchline." The narrative had shifted completely. What started as Tuberville's mocking jab had transformed into a national rallying cry, with Crockett leading the charge. Inside the Senate, Tuberville could feel the walls closing in. Colleagues who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him now kept their distance. A few offered polite nods in the hallway, but none wanted to be caught defending him in front of reporters. Behind closed doors, whispers spread. "He picked the wrong fight," one senator muttered to another as cameras clicked nearby. The clip of Crockett's speech had become impossible to escape. Every news cycle replayed it, every late-night host mocked Tuberville's silence, and every social media feed amplified his humiliation. Even members of his own party began to sidestep questions. When pressed by journalists, some gave carefully worded responses like, "I respect all veterans and their families," while conspicuously avoiding his name. It was a clear sign, Tuberville was on his own. Meanwhile, Crockett's momentum only grew. She was invited to speak at a bipartisan veterans roundtable, where lawmakers from both sides praised her courage. Tuberville, uninvited and unwelcome, watched the headlines pile up, each one a reminder that his smirk had cost him more than he ever expected. The letter itself had become a symbol. Images of Crockett holding it high in the chamber spread across the internet, turned into memes, posters, and even T-shirts with the slogan, *Respect the letter. Respect the sacrifice. *. Veterans organizations began requesting copies of her speech to share at their meetings. Some schools even invited Crockett to speak to students about civic duty and the meaning of service, holding up her father's words as a piece of living history. On social media, hashtags like #VietnamLetter and #CrockettMoment trended for days. People posted photos of their own family letters from wartime, creating a wave of deeply personal stories that resonated far beyond politics. For many Americans, this was no longer about Tuberville's mockery, it was about honoring a generation of veterans whose sacrifices had too often been forgotten. Crockett had tapped into something raw, something real, and it was spreading faster than any campaign ad ever could. And Tuberville? He remained silent, each day watching as the moment he thought would embarrass his opponent instead buried his credibility. The next time Crockett and Tuberville crossed paths in committee, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cameras were rolling, every network ready in case sparks flew again. Tuberville kept his eyes down, shuffling papers, hoping the moment would pass without confrontation. But Crockett didn't let it. Calmly, she leaned into her microphone. "Senator Tuberville," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "I trust you've had time to reflect on the weight of words, how they can wound or how they can heal." Tuberville cleared his throat, his face stiff. "Representative, I've already said I didn't mean." Crockett cut in, sharp but steady. "This isn't about what you meant. It's about what you did. You mocked me in the very moment we were discussing the lives of veterans. That letter you heard, my father's letter, was written in the mud and fear of Vietnam. He didn't have the luxury of smirks or games. He had survival. He had honor." The chamber fell into silence again, just as it had before. Tuberville opened his mouth but found nothing to say. The cameras caught every second of his hesitation. Once again, Crockett had left him speechless, and this time, she did it face to face. The clip of Tuberville's second silence went viral just as quickly as the first. News outlets branded it *round 2, and Crockett wins again. Late night shows replayed the exchange, mocking Tuberville's inability to respond. One host quipped, "At this point, silence isn't golden, it's Tuberville's entire strategy." Poll numbers began to reflect the damage. Surveys showed a sharp decline in his approval rating, especially among veterans and military families. For a senator who once prided himself on patriotic credentials, it was a devastating blow. Meanwhile, Crockett's reputation soared. She was invited to speak at rallies, podcasts, and even primetime interviews where she spoke not just about her father's letter, but about the broader responsibility of leaders to honor sacrifice with action, not sarcasm. Commentators called her the voice of authenticity in a chamber full of noise. For once, it wasn't just political insiders talking, it was everyday Americans who felt moved, inspired, and heard. Tuberville, cornered by his own arrogance, had given Crockett the platform of a lifetime, and she used it masterfully. Crockett wasted no time turning her momentum into concrete action. With bipartisan support gathering behind her, she introduced a sweeping veteran healthcare reform bill. The legislation promised faster access to medical care, expanded mental health services, and stronger protections for military families. At first, skeptics doubted it would pass. Major reforms often stalled in endless partisan fights. But Crockett's viral moment had shifted the political winds. Lawmakers didn't want to be seen standing against the woman who carried her father's Vietnam letter into battle on the Senate floor. When the bill came up for debate, the chamber was packed. Crockett spoke with passion, reminding everyone of the words her father had written decades earlier, "If I don't return, let my sacrifice mean something." Her voice cracked slightly as she repeated the line, but her resolve never faltered. The vote was taken, and to the shock of many, the bill passed with overwhelming support. Cheers erupted in the gallery, veterans hugging their families as Crockett smiled through tears. Tuberville, seated a few rows away, voted against it, but his solitary defiance only deepened his isolation. The night the bill passed, America lit up with celebration. Veterans halls hosted gatherings, families raised toasts, and social media exploded with tributes. Across the country, people shared photos of loved ones in uniform, pairing them with Crockett's now famous words, "You can mock me, but you cannot erase them." Major cities projected images of folded flags and the phrase, "For those who served," onto skyscrapers. In small towns, American Legion posts framed Crockett's speech beside their walls of honor. For many, her father's Vietnam letter became more than history, it became a living testament to the value of sacrifice. News anchors called it a legislative victory born from a single moment of truth. Commentators across the spectrum admitted that Crockett had managed to turn raw emotion into lasting change, a feat rarely seen in modern politics. Meanwhile, Tuberville stayed quiet. He avoided cameras, skipped interviews, and released only bland statements that failed to stem the tide of criticism. While Crockett's face filled TV screens nationwide, his absence spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. Weeks later, the story of Jasmine Crockett and her father's Vietnam letter was no longer just a headline, it had become a defining chapter in political history. Commentators said it was the rare moment when authenticity overpowered arrogance, when truth silenced mockery. Crockett's approval soared, but more importantly, so did trust in her leadership. Veterans' families wrote letters thanking her for giving voice to their pain, for showing the country that sacrifice must be honored, not ridiculed. Her father's words, once hidden in an old envelope, were now etched into the nation's conscience. Tuberville, meanwhile, never recovered from the humiliation. The smirk that had once defined him was now a symbol of everything wrong with dismissive politics. Whenever he spoke, critics reminded him of the moment he was silenced by a letter written in the jungles of Vietnam. His credibility was cracked beyond repair. For Crockett, the victory wasn't about going viral, it was about keeping a promise. She had carried her father's legacy into the chamber and used it to fight for those who served. And when history looked back, it wasn't the senator's laughter that endured. It was a daughter's voice, reading her father's words, shutting down arrogance with truth. The letter had done more than silence a senator. It had changed the course of a debate, passed a law, and reminded a nation of the cost of freedom.